Good afternoon and welcome once again to the Week in Review. In this program each weekend, we look back at the previous week and highlight the major news stories that took place, giving you a second chance to see some of the things which for one reason or another you might have happened to miss as they were happening. This week, there is word that CN is planning to close down its rail operations in this province, and reaction to that news is immediate. The airport in St. John's receives a couple of bomb threats. Federal government employees take a lunch hour to protest lagging contract talks. And the price of world oil takes a drastic plunge. We'll have details of those stories and others when the Week in Review continues in just a moment.
I'm Michael Connors. Join me every weekend on NTV's Issues and Answers as I interview the province's top newsmakers. That's Issues and Answers, airing at 12:30 every Sunday on NTV, 12 noon in most of Labrador.
I'm Beth Penny. We could all use a little bit of good news these days, so join me Monday nights on the award-winning NTV Evening News Hour for Silver Linings.
It was early in the week that reports were carried in the Toronto Globe and Mail that CN officials have approached the Federal Transport Ministry in an effort to have the rail service in this province discontinued. The paper said that CN wants the service discontinued because of money losses in the operations. At an afternoon press conference on Monday, Newfoundland's Premier Brian Peckford said that he was unaware that any such a move was afoot. However, he added that if money is indeed the issue, closing down the service will do little to solve the problem.
I want to make it abundantly clear to everybody in Newfoundland and Labrador two things. One, as far as I know, and I've been close to this over the last 3 or 4 weeks myself personally with Mr. Daw, that talks are continuing between the Government of Newfoundland and the Government of Canada, and no final decision has been made relative to the railway. That's number one. And number two, as I've said for many, many years, the position of the Newfoundland Government was made clear to Mr. Mazankowski last fall when he met us here in Newfoundland. And that is, we want to see the railway continued and upgraded, and that it will be another mode of transportation in Newfoundland. Thirdly, there has been some discussion from the media, which I think I had to respond to, facts put out, that the Newfoundland Railway is losing money. That is not new to anybody, and that CN is losing money. CN is losing money all across this nation. Our, not estimate, the facts that we have from the federal government is that CN is subsidized by the federal government throughout Canada to the tune of $1.5 billion. So if there is some speculation in the media that CN and the federal government want to solve the CN financial problem of $1.5 billion, I don't think it's going to be solved by picking off Newfoundland for 30 or 40 million. It's a $1.5 billion problem.
Meanwhile, that same day, representatives of the union, which represents workers of the railway in this province, indicated they do not believe that the feds will indeed close down the operations. Mike Walsh indicated that he is looking into the media reports, but he added at that time he didn't think they were all that factual.
We have no thoughts the railroad is going to disappear in Newfoundland because we have been told by the Government of Canada, to the politicians, to cabinet ministers, to the bureaucrats, that the railroad in Newfoundland will stay in Newfoundland unless the Government of Newfoundland decides otherwise. In other words, they have put the decision on the doorsteps of the Honourable Brian Peckford. The decision is his to make, and he has made a very firm statement in recent months, not once but many times, that it is his position, his government's position, that the railroad will stay in Newfoundland. They are not interested in anything, a trade-off or what have you, that they definitely are going to keep the railroad in Newfoundland. And with that kind of assurance from the Premier of Newfoundland and the Government of Canada, who've also said that it won't go unless the Government of Newfoundland wanted to go, we have no reason to think that it is going to go, regardless of what Canadian National request or not they might make. Canadian National is a Crown Corporation answerable to the Government of Canada. And if the Government of Canada stand firm with the Government of Newfoundland and say that the railroad is here and is going to stay, we have no quarrel with that. We know it's going to stay.
A report on this province's position on northern cod stocks, entitled Strength from the Sea, came down in St. John's on Monday. Premier Brian Peckford says the report will be distributed widely throughout the country. The Premier says the document is filled with personal explanations on his part as to why the province has adopted its stand. That evening, Austin Green had this report.
The Premier says he wants the cod stocks along the north and east coasts of Newfoundland and Labrador to be fished exclusively by fleets from the area. He says that's the way the resource is treated in the Gulf of St. Lawrence and on the Scotian Shelf.
The policy is that whoever is closest to the resource, the fishery resource, has first crack on processing it and harvesting it. Over the last number of years, there has been some erosion of that principle as it relates to the northern cod stock. We just want to reestablish the principle that has always been applied by the federal government in their own policy statements, that the best way that this defined cod stock can be used is to help those who are nearest to it.
To sell his position, Peckford has produced a policy document. It's to be distributed throughout the nation to politicians, journalists, and targeted organizations. Much of the blame for the present state of the fishery is directed at foreign fleets. During the 50s, 60s, and 70s, foreign fleets undertook unprecedented harvests of northern cod. The resource was sorely depleted. Canada imposed a 200-mile limit in 1977 to try to restore those stocks. But foreign fleets continue to ignore that limit. Last year, the West Germans were caught overfishing. Now their fishing permits are under review. Fisheries Minister Tom Rideout wants them cancelled.
But the agreement itself expires next year, and it's our position, been strongly presented now several times and concurred in by the Atlantic ministers and by the industry in Atlantic Canada, that once it runs out, it shouldn't be renewed.
Peckford hopes his nationwide speaking tour will result in a shift in public opinion towards his position. He says that will give him some extra clout in negotiations with Ottawa. Austin Green, NTV News.
Last weekend, 2 bomb scares involving the airport in St. John's were received, one at the headquarters of the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary, the other at the ticket offices of Air Canada at the airport. As we heard in this report by NTV's Paul Harpel on Monday evening, at that time, officials with the Department of Transport were keeping rather quiet on the matter.
Shortly before 9 o'clock Saturday night, the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary received an anonymous phone call from a male claiming there was a bomb at the St. John's Airport.
Well, it was a male caller. He called here at approximately 8:55 p.m. on Saturday, January 18th, and he just said that there was a bomb at the St. John's Airport and hung up.
Shortly after, Air Canada officials received a similar call. Today, when NTV contacted the Department of Transport to get further details, an official with the department would only say that 2 security threats had been reported Saturday evening. It was not until we contacted the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary that it was learned bomb threats were involved. Lieutenant Skeen of the Constabulary was on duty the night the call came in. He outlines what they did after the call was received.
We responded by sending one of our sergeants to the airport after receiving the call here at the police headquarters. And the sergeant assisted the airport people in carrying out their emergency procedures with regard to the threat.
Skeen says although they are questioning suspects, no arrests have been made up to now.
It seems apparent that the bomb scares at the St. John's Airport this past weekend are connected to reports last week that security had been tightened at other airports across Canada. However, Transport Canada officials would not comment on the possible connection. Paul Harpel, NTV News.
Shifting, or at least staying with, I should say, airport-related stories this week, but now shifting to Gander. MHA for the area, Winston Baker, says Federal Justice Minister John Crosbie has put some pressure on some of his cabinet colleagues to overrule the recommendations of their officials. Baker says the reports of several departments in Ottawa have stated that the airport in Torbay cannot accommodate international flights, that for security reasons. And he says, should Air Canada be given approval to operate international flights out of St. John's, the capital city would become a haven for terrorists.
Crosbie is presently putting pressure on 4 or 5 federal cabinet ministers, and the pressure is to get them to overrule their departments. Customs, immigration, health, Agriculture Canada, the RCMP, these people have all given opinions on the move of international flights to St. John's. And their opinion basically is this, that Torbay, under no circumstances, even with extensive renovations and increased staff, Torbay cannot handle international flights without violating the law of the land, regulations of various government departments, and in fact violating international convention.
So if those recommendations are ignored, if they're overruled by the ministers, St. John's, in getting international flights coming in here, would actually be opening the door basically for terrorists, because they know that the security measures aren't as high here.
Absolutely. The main clauses that are being violated have to do with what they call security and sterility. From the point of view of international passengers not being able to pass off things, there being no contact between domestic and international passengers and so on. And they feel that just putting a curtain across half of the baggage area, taking half the baggage area there in Torbay, does not meet the security and sterility arrangements.
Newfoundlanders are given the chance to voice their opinions on international relations, and business property tax assessments in St. John's, or at least the increases of those assessments, might be illegal. We'll have details of those stories and others when the Week in Review continues in just a moment. A special joint parliamentary committee on Canadian international relations was in St. John's for the latter part of this past week. On Thursday, the group began receiving public information input as to what government's green paper on foreign relations was really all about and the impact that those people felt the green paper would have. St. John's marked the first stop on the panel's cross-country tour. That evening, we had this report.
The visit to St. John's by this special committee, comprised of both Senate and House of Commons members, is the third stopover for the group. They are looking for the public's view on where Canada's current and future international relations should focus. They are interested in local concerns, however, they also want our views on global issues.
I think it's condescending to go to my hometown, London, or St. John's, or Saskatoon, and say, we just want to hear your opinions on your local regional things. We want the big picture to be left to people that live in Ottawa. I think that's wrong. I think your opinions on aid or arms control are just as important as anybody in Ottawa or Toronto. And I sense a real prejudice in Ottawa of when you leave Ottawa to do hearings, don't let them talk about the grand issues that everybody's concerned about, like aid or trade. Just let the regions talk about their regional concerns. I think that's wrong. We want to know your views on the grand issues, the issues of national concern, as well as the regional issues. I'd like to hear both. Lisa?
One of the people that made a submission to the committee today was former federal cabinet minister Don Jamieson. He touched on Canada's and more specifically Newfoundland's ties with European countries, saying the federal government had seemingly dropped their interest in European markets. He suggested that Ottawa renew their interests in that area more so than trying to break down barriers in the United States. The committee will hold an open meeting for the general public tonight and conclude their trip to Newfoundland tomorrow morning with a final session. Paul Harpel, NTV News.
Thousands of federal government employees across the country spent their lunch hours on the sidewalks on Tuesday of this week. The workers, members of the Public Service Alliance of Canada, want Treasury Board negotiators to change their attitude at the bargaining table. In St. John's, demonstrations were held at 3 locations. These people are all workers at the Sir Humphrey Gilbert building in St. John's, which houses a number of federal government offices. They are all civil servants, as most of us know them, and they're all members of the Public Service Alliance of Canada. These workers are not on strike. Rather, they're demonstrating their dissatisfaction with the slow pace of contract negotiations with the Federal Treasury Board. These aren't the only federal government employees to demonstrate during their lunch hours today in St. John's. A total of 1,300 of the capital city workers took to the sidewalks, carrying signs and passing out information leaflets around the taxation center and the employment and immigration offices in Pleasantville as well. Being the most easterly point in Canada, Newfoundland's workers, of course, had their lunch hours before their counterparts throughout the rest of the country. But at the appropriate time, they too were showing their displeasure with the negotiating process as it presently exists.
The government and Federal Treasury Board has not been taking us serious. They've been not really calling our union a real strong union. So I think if we can get like thousands and thousands of people out across the country today at those demonstrations, that Treasury Board will finally sit down and say, well, you know, maybe they are a union and maybe they do really mean business, and maybe the only way to get them to sign a collective agreement is job security and tech change clauses in the collective agreement.
To a person, all the demonstrators are upset over much the same things, namely the fact that some 1,000 workers have already been given notices that they have been declared surplus. They feel the federal government is using their collective bargaining process to justify their cutback policies. Their employer, they say, is trying to negotiate 0 to 3.5% wage increases in lieu of all other demands. And last, but by no means least, they are losing job security proposals at the bargaining table.
I've personally been without a contract for 14 months now, and before that had my raise cut back to the 6 and 5, which made quite a difference in what we had negotiated before that. So I think, yes, it could be quite effective.
John, what do you think the major issues are? What's the biggest message you're trying to get across to the federal government?
Job parity from the East Coast to the West Coast, right? Job wage parity from the East Coast to West Coast, very majorly.
We haven't had a contract in 18 months.
Local PSAC officials were obviously very pleased with today's turnout in St. John's, but also on hand for the kickoff of the nationwide protest was Pat Fortune, a member of the association's National Board of Directors, and he too had nothing but praise for the show of support the union executive has received.
I'm just amazed that the people are out in the numbers that they're out in, and I think that there's no question that a firm message will go to the government, the federal government, that people working for them are entitled to be treated fairly, that they're entitled to job security, and that after nearly 3-4 years without a contract not imposed by Parliament, they're entitled to fair negotiations.
Obviously, in your position, you get a chance to go right across the country. Here in Newfoundland, we tend to be thought of as way off in the east and left out of it. Do you get that feeling here today?
Far from it. Newfoundland is the dead center of it at this particular point in time.
And you're pleased with what you're seeing here then?
I'm very pleased.
Do you think it's going to work?
Pleased. I think so. I don't think that that the government really realizes the concern and the worry that it causes to its own employees by its policies.
The Alliance says government workers are not only fighting to keep their jobs, but for the well-being of the Canadian public as well. And they say if demonstrations such as those conducted today are still not enough to convince Ottawa that they mean business, they will go farther.
If this doesn't work, if it's not enough, is a strike a good possibility?
I wouldn't be at all surprised.
I think that if Treasury Board don't take us serious at these demonstrations and still thinks we're not a real strong union and still thinks that the membership is not behind our leadership, that we can go further. I think this is an excellent show, and I think it gives us a good handle on the situation. And if need be, if it comes down to the point, to the crunch, our executive has told us that they will not be recommending a contract unless it has a job security clause. So if it doesn't have a job security clause, there's a possibility of a strike for sure.
The recent increases of assessments on property taxes on businesses by the St. John's City Council may be illegal, at least according to the president of the St. John's Board of Trade. Bernie Beckett on Tuesday indicated the board had made that point in a brief presented to the city fathers. Beckett says the city went about the whole thing in the wrong way.
We presented some background material on the city assessments that took place this last while, and we also presented them with recommendations. There are 7 recommendations in our brief, which we have presented to the City Council, and we are looking forward to a response from them in the very near future.
Now, I understand you have some problems with the city's authority to actually increase the business assessment.
We've raised an issue with the City Council with regard to the way they've done the assessments this year, and it has been expressed to us that perhaps the city needs to assess the residential as well as the commercial properties within the same period. As we know, This year they did the commercial properties, I should say, in 1985, and in 1986 they're going to do the residential properties. What this may lead to is not a uniform system of assessing the properties in the city, and we wonder if that's not contrary to the Assessment Act of St. John's.
So does it mean that businesses will be end up paying more than homeowners or, on the same scale?
For the current year, businesses are paying more of the city revenues in taxation than perhaps they might have otherwise. If we assume, for example, that the residential properties increase in value somewhat similar to the commercial properties, then perhaps the tax revenue required to run the city in this next year may be spread more evenly across the whole system, rather than businesses this year paying a greater proportion of the tax revenue.
Was it necessary for the city to have those evaluations done on 1985 and then the home properties in 1986, or was it just a bad decision, do you feel, on their part?
The city, or I should say the assessors, the assessing department made its decision under the Act to do it in that manner. And I guess what we're saying to them, have they interpreted the legislation correctly? And we've asked them to go back and have a look at it. And if it is found that there's something wrong with it, then we've asked them to consider what other options are available and whether or not they should have a different assessment role for 1985-86.
Well, of course, around the world this past week, there was dramatic reaction to the sudden drop in the benchmark price of world oil. In the House of Commons, Finance Minister Michael Wilson came under repeated fire and questioning over high Canadian gasoline prices, which consumers are continuing to pay despite the falling price of world oil. On Tuesday, OPEC set the cost of a barrel of oil at $19.50 American, and it fell even lower before the week was out. On Wednesday in the House, the opposition wanted to know why the drop was not being reflected at the gas pumps.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance, of course, neglects to remind the House that his colleague, when she signed the so-called Western Accord, promised Canadians that gas prices in this country would go down as oil prices went down, and that is not happening. My question to the Minister is, why do Canadian motorists pay $5 more federal tax when they fill up a tank than does an American motorist?
On September the 4th of 1974, we were presented with the present of a $38 billion deficit and growing very quickly. There were a number of elements that we took into account in dealing with that problem. One was the most substantial drop in government spending that any government has brought in history of Canada. A very large proportion of our policies towards that have been on the spending side. There has been a little bit on the tax side, part of which has been in excise taxes, and that has had some impact on the price of gasoline. But, Mr. Speaker, let me also have...
Order. My question simply to the Minister is this. Considering that Petro-Canada was created not to act like Shell and Gulf and Esso and simply maximize its profits, but to act in consumer interests as well, will the government use the authority it has and instruct Petro-Canada to bring down its prices now?
Mr. Speaker, Petro-Canada, we're taking about $400 million a year from the federal treasury, and we thought that was an excessive amount of money for that company to take. We told them to act as a commercial organization, and that's what they're doing now. And what I have been hearing from some of my constituents, maybe the honourable member is hearing that the same from his constituents, is that Petro-Canada is undercutting some of the oil companies in their market pricing in my part of the country. So in some cases, Petro-Canada are bringing the prices down, and I think the honourable member should be pleased with that.
And finally, still with the oil and gasoline prices, Newfoundland's Finance Minister, Dr. John Collins, apparently agrees with his federal counterpart. Collins indicated that it's a matter of waiting to see how the various components involved in the pricing of gas react. And if such reaction is favorable, then Newfoundlanders could well find a decrease at the pumps, and that within a couple of months' time.
As I know, there hasn't as yet been any decrease at the pumps, and that's for two reasons, I guess. Firstly, the oil, the product that came from crude oil is the crude oil that has been in the pipeline before the drops, and there are certain tax increases going on. For instance, the federal excise tax was increased there, I think it was the 1st of this year, 1st of January. And then there was an oil company, a manufacturer's, a refiner's increase there, I think it was sometime in December. So these increases have been going on.
If that price maintains a low below $20 a barrel, could that possibly mean in the future there would be a chop in price of some sort?
I certainly would expect so, because the refineries themselves would have lower costs. Then there are their refinery charges. Now, I don't know what's happening to those. Perhaps they're still going up. But they would certainly be offset by the lower cost of crude. And then, of course, the provincial tax is related to the refinery costs. In other words, if the refinery cost goes down, our tax goes down. It's related to it.
And that completes our look at the major news stories for the week of January the 19th through the 25th. Remember, if you happen to miss something, as it happens through the course of the week, join us each weekend when we'll be doing our best to recap the major news stories for you. Oh, by the way, there is one other thing. Today is, in fact, the birthday of the famed Scottish poet Robert Burns. So to one and all, happy Burns Day. For the Week in Review, I'm Alan Rowe, wishing you a most enjoyable week.
Bringing the world to Newfoundland and Labrador, we reach more homes and families than we ever have before. New faces and familiar friends to